You are listening to the Foreign Policy Focus podcast.
We cannot wait for the final proof. The smoking gun could come in the form of a mushroom cloud.
Haven't you driven enough people from their homes already? Bulldoze their villages, seize their property under laws they had no part in making.
Now working in Libya with friends and allies, we've demonstrated what collective action can achieve in the 21st century.
Now the host of the show, Kyle Ansel.
This is episode 242 of the Foreign Policy Focus podcast. Today's episode is going to have two parts. I do an interview on the first part about, charitable giving to Yemen and supporting Save the Children in Yemen. And then on the second part of the show, I go over some recent news. So the interview is kind of short, and don't turn off the podcast after because there is a second part to the show. And here's the interview. Welcome to episode 242 of the Foreign Policy Focus podcast. I have a very special guest on today's show. She's a voluntarist and a liberty activist who's really looking to get out there and make a difference, not, to make more libertarians, but to really help people. And that is Tricia Stuart. Tricia, welcome to the show.
Hi, Kyle. Thanks for having me.
No problem. And I'm sure some of my audience will recognize your name from, just around kind of the Facebook libertarian circle. You're very active in that. But I have you on today's show, a show about foreign policy, not necessarily about libertarianism, to discuss this new campaign drive you got going on, and that is to actually help the children in Yemen. About a week ago or so, I noticed in my group, the private Facebook group Foreign Policy Focus that any of my listeners could join, Tricia posted a question to the group saying that, hey, what are some actual charities that, we could donate to or support to actually help the people of Yemen? And honestly, I came up blank because, the situation in Yemen is absolutely horrific. There's a blockade of the country. You could donate to large international groups, maybe like the Arab Red Crescent, and they do get some aid in, but, can you actually trust that the money you're donating is going to that source? And Tricia went out and I guess did the research and came out with an answer for us. So Tricia, I guess first of all, what even motivated you to care about Yemen and why are you so interested?
Well, as being somebody that's anti-warist, which most liberty-minded libertarians are angry about it and you feel helpless. And I didn't want to feel like that anymore. And the political process to me seems always like a dead end. And that's not to say that people that aren't are politically active, aren't doing their own part. But I thought, what if we could just help people? Because I understand the situation there. And it's just very, very ridiculous that children are dying from literally having cholera and diarrhea. And so what can we do to get something to these people? What can I do as a voluntarist to give? And it was funny because I looked into a lot of charities and there's really not many that are over there helping. It's a very difficult situation to get into. But I did find Save the Children, and they have a Yemen chapter, good charity. And so I thought, what if we start a Facebook campaign with some of my fellow liberty lovers and CAPS voluntarists? I throw everybody in there because if you want to help people and you're anti-war and you want to help the victims of war, come on and join. I'm not going to discriminate against your, political associations or anything like that. So I am part of the Liberty Network and in a lot of other groups. So I thought this would be a really cool platform to start a charity campaign.
Can you talk a little bit more about the charity Save the Children? We talked a little bit before the show about, what they actually do with the money, how much of the money actually goes to the charity, and generally, can you give money directly to Yemen? Because I know with some of these large groups, you can only donate money to the charity itself and not like to, the people of Yemen.
Yes, absolutely. And that was one of my, as well as some of the other people that I'm working with in Liberty Network, our concerns, because we specifically wanted this to be response to the crisis in Yemen, the civil war, the U.S. backing, the Saudis, that kind of issue. So we wanted to specifically help them, and Save the Children does that. So if you go to their site and you literally can just type in their search engine Yemen, or you can go to Save the Children/Yemen, it will link you to the chapters there. They have several offices there, and you donate to them. 86% of what you donate goes to that chapter. Now, like any charity, they have a little overhead. They are doing emergency funds right now because of the situation being really, really bad in there. So it just so happens that right now the emergency fund of Save the Children is actually going to the kids in Yemen. They desperately need more mobile health units, food, water supplies, personal hygiene units, and things like that. So your money is going to go there. Also, obviously, it's tax deductible, and you can look at their website. It will link you to all their accreditations. Legit, they've been there since 1968. They do good. They do good work.
And this is really important. And the work and the research you went out and did here is, really valuable. I read articles a lot about the situation in Yemen, and it's incredible that the children there are not just dying from bombs. And of course, Saudi Arabia does blow up school buses and, killed dozens of children at a time. But at the same time, there's hundreds of thousands, if not millions of Yemeni children that are dying from starvation, from cholera, from very treatable and preventable illnesses and deaths. And so what this charity does is it helps those children. And so, I don't think it's invaluable to look at maybe the political possibilities to end the bombing campaign. But at the same time, you have to change the situation on the ground and give resources to the kids in Yemen who are dying and just struggling and dying because they don't have enough nutrition to live. And so that's, really the such important work that you did by, finding this charity and what all those aid workers are doing right now in Yemen. And the difficulty is that not every charity could operate right now in Yemen. Saudi Arabia has pretty much a complete blockade of the country.
Yeah, exactly.
Before the show, we were talking about how we don't really value the legitimacy of the UN, but at the same time, they're the, international group that, eventually gets the aid around the Saudi blockade and inspections of the country to get it in. And so, you do have to go with, these kind of charities. And at the same time, you can't just go to any random Yemeni page and try to donate to some local thing because, you'll end up on some FBI list and arrested for terrorism, it's the fear. So, or, it just goes to some rich guy somewhere and they just
or Hillary
steal the
Clinton.
money. Yeah. Or donate to the, the pockets of the Clintons through the Clinton Foundation, right? But you've really identified a great one here and for a cause that, they're in desperate need in Yemen. And so much of it is because of the fault of the United States. I thought the campaign that you're doing, though, is really interesting and how you and Gons are trying to utilize your Facebook network to really, increase the reach of this donation. Talk a little bit too about what your, donations have been so far. But just, you're using the Facebook groups like Liberty Network and the meme pages to really make a difference. So talk a little bit about that.
Yes. So part of this was inspired by, I'm a libertarian, so therefore I like, I suppose. I run some meme pages. I make them. I think they can be really poignant and make good points. And it's kind of part of the libertarian community. I really feel like at least the social media community aspect. But I see so many anti-war memes, which are really, they can be really powerful. But at the same time, sometimes I think we sit and we bemoan what our government does, and then we just make a meme about it, and that's it. So we thought to do this campaign and kind of let it be organic. We've reached out to some meme pages, and things are becoming in the next couple weeks where it would be like, and forgive me for bringing this up, like the Ice Bucket Challenge campaign, where it would be put your money where your memes are campaign. So drop some good anti-war memes. And if you really are anti-war, then maybe you could donate to help some of the victims of war. And I think we get so frustrated as libertarians, voluntarists, of what our government does, because, sometimes it just seems like it's insurmountable to be able to stop what they're doing. But government doesn't produce anything. People do. That's what Liberty Network's kind of about, people that produce and small business owners and things like that. So the power of government is limited to stealing and bombing. And really the power of the individual and to individuals making voluntary associations and giving, well, that's something government can never do. I mean, we have that hands down. We create, and we can help, and we can heal. And that's something we can do. So we got our heads together and thought, let's start this campaign.
All right. Well, it's really a great idea, and I'm not big into memes, but I have a podcast, so I guess for me, it's
Yes.
put my money where my mouth is.
Oh, that's the other part of being a libertarian, right, Kyle? You have to have a
Right.
podcast.
So
enjoy yourself.
I'm going to throw some, money at it, and I encourage all my listeners to as well. I'm going to make sure I link to, the Save the Children page that, goes directly to Yemen on the show notes page. And I'll link to the Liberty, Network Facebook group, which, I think is big in driving this. And, Tricia, if you have any otherwhere you want me to link, I'll do that in the show notes page as well. Do you have anything else you want to add to this?
Well, I just wanted to say thanks so much for giving this some attention. I appreciate it. I like your podcast a lot because you have a really good conversational way of breaking down what's going on around the world. And that's really important. And please, people, voluntarily give.
All right. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Kyle.
All right. Here's where we're going to get into the second part of the show. And it's just going to be me going over a couple news stories solo. Of course, the tragedy in Yemen is horrific, but there is another case of an ethnic cleansing campaign going on in the world, and that is in Myanmar, where you have the majority Buddhist military attacking the minority Muslim Rojava group. I think just generally to break it down, Myanmar, or the former, I believe, Burma, was a kind of centrally controlled state by the military, and then recently the military has given up some of its powers, but most of the powers still remain in the hands of the military, especially when it comes to policing, defense, and stuff like that. I think the presidency mostly controls kind of the social issues. I believe the numbers break down to something like 87% Buddhist in Myanmar, and then the 4% are these Rohingya Muslims, who are a very small minority and kind of exists in a small corner of the state up near Bangladesh. I think there's some sentiment among the people of Myanmar that these people should actually, just go to Bangladesh and stay there. They don't belong in our country. From, the limited history that I've been able to gather about these people, I think a lot of them ended up in Myanmar, in that region, during the British Empire, where they, I guess, were kind of imported to use as labor in that country. And then, of course, population grows and spreads, etc. And I'm not sure, there's a few million of those people living in Myanmar, and I should have had it, but I don't. But I know that the latest estimates of, the tragedy that has happened in it, is slowly continuing to happen there, is 700,000 people displaced, with tens of thousands killed. And then I've seen official numbers around 6,700, and I think those are where they've been able to count the bodies. Now, the violence and the problems here aren't new, and prior to, this going on, there were these Rohingya refugees already living abroad in both India and Bangladesh. And many of them in refugee camps that are very dangerous. I think since even this ethnic cleansing campaign, the latest one really began over the summer, there were a few children that were actually trampled to death by an elephant in one of these, displaced people refugee camps. And then these people have some problems in India as well, as I believe the Indian government is looking to do the equivalent of kind of revoking their refugee status and telling them they need to leave the country. It's also worth noting that the current president in Myanmar, who I said doesn't have, powers like the American president does, was somebody that was very much glorified of the West. A woman, she won a Nobel Peace Prize and was held up on a pedestal by the Obama government, and under the Clinton presidency, really made to be, kind of a hero or a champion. So this article, that I'm drawing a lot of my knowledge from, by Margolis and published on uns.com, and I'll link to this article in the show notes page. Really, mostly details on the failures of the president to step up and do anything, even if it's just politically to condemn what's going on. Instead, her government has really just been the pawn of the military, and has provided diplomatic cover, kind of within the country and the international community for what's going on. she's not going out there and saying that, all these people have been murdered, all these women have been raped. There's a really terrible thing going on. We need it to stop right now. I'm standing up to the military. I'm calling on the international community to really protect me and, to guide, some help here. But instead, it seems that, she's kind of just cowered in place. As I mentioned on the last show, there was a UN report that came out that specifically criticized her and recommended 6 military, officers for war crimes. It seems that when you do have 10,000 dead in this very controlled campaign that unfolded over a few months where a lot of villages were burned and, women were raped, and in very systematic ways, including by having villagers burn their own villages and then recording it. Of course, they don't show that guns were pointed at these people, as they were being forced to burn their own villages on video. Another important detail in this story that Eric Margolis highlights in this article is that the military faction, the military controlling portion of the government is favored by China. And, as I've detailed in the past with the United States, having a position on the UN Security Council is very powerful, but if not, having somebody on the Security Council who will veto anything that condemns you is also a very powerful diplomatic tool. And it seems that the ruling military junta in Myanmar does have that from China, and so this is also allowing some of these crimes to either go unnoticed or with less force. The international community that would come down on Myanmar had there not been a Security Council member to veto some of these things and direct UN attention and policy. And it's important to mention that I don't, necessarily support the whole idea of international government and people doing things. However, this is the body that right now is being put in place to investigate it. And if it's not doing anything, then people kind of shrug their shoulders and assume that either nothing's going on or it's not that big of a deal. When it had the UN been doing more for the Palestinians, for the Houthis or the Yemenis or for the Rohingya, then, at least more attention is being paid to it. And the international organization, which everybody tasks is, be the one that, cares for and looks after all these, disenfranchised people. If they're not doing anything, like I said, it allows people just to kind of turn their heads the other way and say, oh, not that much is going on. The UN hasn't even done anything. All right. So like I said, that article linked in the show notes page. The other big news here is something that, I actually, kind of regret that I've neglected to cover this on the show. And that is 2 Reuters journalists were imprisoned in Myanmar a few months ago on charges that they were, spreading fake news or, the equivalent to that. These 2 journalists were just sentenced to 7 years in prison each by an official. It doesn't even sound like this, went through, any sort of what we would call legal practice. It's more just like an arbitrary walks in the room, reads the documents and said, 7 years. Now, from what I was able to gather, these journalists don't seem to have actually published anything fake, and that it seems that they were almost set up, maybe that they were generally trying to cover what was happening to the Rohingya people, and then the government stepped in and did something of an entrapment scheme, where they passed them fake information and then arrested them for possessing this fake information. The narrative from the journalists is that they only actually had this information for a few hours and really didn't even have a chance to go through it to confirm it or not, but were arrested pretty much immediately and then charged with the crime of possessing it. I'm not sure, exactly where the truth is, because like I said, there wasn't like a trial process that I'm aware of where all this information was able to come out. And so, maybe until these people are freed and really able to tell their story freely on the international stage, we won't know, if they were set up or if, maybe they're manufacturing fake information. And this is an important kind of thing just to mention here is that, this is why it becomes so dangerous if we let the government start to determine what, real and truthful news is or not, just because you could wind yourself up in a situation where you have people at the FCC handing out prison sentences for people who are, alleged to, possess or publish fake news. Couple stories on Afghanistan. The first one is General Scott Miller has officially taken charge of the troops there, and in his outgoing, statement or address, the former General Nicholas, who, is worth mentioning, this is one of the first guys in Afghanistan, 2001, and ends up being the commander of forces there. Something that Scott Horton said on the show is just that if you're going to fight this war, nobody really knows this war better than the outgoing general. But he said, it's time for the war in Afghanistan to end. Of course, he puts most of the onus on the Taliban to give up and stop fighting for their own country and not pressure on the United States as much, to kind of be the ones that realize that we're fighting an aggressive war in Afghanistan that has now gone on for 70 years and is completely pointless. This war is not without cost for the Americans, and those costs are not limited to dollars, but American lives. We had another soldier killed in an insider attack. To me, this just seems like the best kind of sign that it's absolutely time to end this war. If our soldiers continue to be killed because we can't even recruit people who don't want to kill us, people who are willing to turn their guns on the Americans as soon as they can, pull the trigger, killing one of our soldiers knowing full well they're gonna die, after training with them, this is crazy. These are people that we enlist to fight in the Afghan army that end up turning their guns on their trainers, their American trainers, and killing them. We pretend that these advise and assist roles are completely, kind of safe and, we're just standing behind the lines. But as we've seen time and time again in Afghanistan, there's a real risk to Americans being in this position. And, now everybody is kind of like, well, we're just kind of in Afghanistan. That's the way it's going to be. More so than the, however many $50, $60 billion a year that the war is going to continue to cost the American people. It's going to cost us with, more and more lives. And even, I think the total now is only 6 this year in 2018. That's 6 too many, 6 people who died pointlessly. The U.S. is considering sending more lethal aid to Ukraine. This is a policy under Obama. They would only provide the Ukrainian government with non-lethal support. Of course, what happens in Ukraine is the 2014 coup orchestrated by the Americans causes the country to fracture. A civil war, Crimea goes and joins Russia, but there's a large portion of eastern Ukraine called the Donbas region, and there you have a group of rebels who will not bend a knee to the government in Kiev, and say that if that's the way you want to run your country, we want to be a different country. And in fact, have even asked to join Russia. Putin has refused that request. So civil war breaks out in the country, more than 10,000 people, and I think the numbers I have read are around 13 to 16,000 people in total killed. But that war is still ongoing. There's still pretty frequent fighting and violations of the ceasefire there. However, large-scale fighting doesn't really break out. But people, do still die in the war. In fact, the leader of the rebellion in Ukraine actually was just killed in a bombing of his location. The Ukrainian government, as predicted, I guess, denies involvement in that bombing. It's possible that I suppose they had nothing to do with it, and I'm sure there's factions among these rebel groups, and maybe somebody is just looking to take the helm because they disagree with the leadership. Or it could have been, the Ukrainian government as well that, planted this bomb, or any number of people, including, Russia or the United States. Now, the problem here is that this war is being fought, on Russia's border, on Russia's doorstep, and Russia isn't too comfortable with the United States arming a government in Ukraine that's hostile to them. There's also an issue that there's heavy neo-Nazi influences now within the Ukrainian government, including some of the most powerful military battalions fighting in the civil war, the Azov battalion being one, and then the speaker actually of the Ukrainian parliament, as documented by Mads Blumenthal, is a follower of neo-Nazi Stefan Bandera. And so, there's many reasons for the, people of Eastern Ukraine not to want to be part of the Ukrainian government, and for the United States to not arm Ukraine, including, it's just the kind of thing that heightens the conflict. If the United States provides more arms and weapons to the Ukrainian government, then the Russians will just provide more arms, weapons, and aid to the rebels to, kind of offset those strategic advances that the Ukrainian government would be receiving. Of course, the additional weapons could lead to increased conflict and quagmire. I mean, kind of look just what happened in the Syrian civil war. The United States provided more and more support to the rebels there, but all that really did is extend the civil war and, just draw other countries like Hezbollah, Iran, or Russia into the conflict more and more. And then the issue of, just who ends up getting the arms is a real problem, and nobody wants to give weapons to Nazis. All right, last thing. The fighting in Libya's capital city continued. There was a headline that got some attention over the weekend. 400 inmates escaped from the prison in Libya's capital, Tripoli. I don't know who are in all these Libyan prisons. For all I know, these are a bunch of innocent people that did nothing wrong. It's possible that this was the, mass security prison. And, these are all people who committed mass murders and are slave traders. Either way, though, it does show instability within whatever's going on in Tripoli if you have this mass escape of prisoners, though. And, that country is a very dangerous place right now. There continues to be fighting going on in and around the capital city. And, we have to remember that the destabilization of Libya was caused by a United States and French-led effort. This was Hillary Clinton and Barack Obama's war to dethrone Gaddafi and have him, killed in a brutal way on the side of the road. And yet when most people talk about Americans' foreign policy and the legacy of these people, Obama, Hillary Clinton, John McCain, they never mention the fact of that they destroyed the entire country, Libya there. So anyways, foreignpolicyfocus.libsyn.com if you want to share the show. Libertarianinstitute.org is the best place to find everything I do, including the daily news roundup. Immersionnews.com. The show notes pages, I will be sure to include the links to the Yemen charity that, I talked about in the first part of the show. And, if you donate to them and then you got more money you still want to give away, think about giving it to me. Patreon.com/foreignpolicyfocus. Twitter is at KYAAALE. And Facebook is Libertarian Union.